So we'll just have to give them a moment to join.
Barry!
Chris, how you doing?
Good, I haven't seen you in a while. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it has been quite a while. Is it when we were hanging out in the park in Toronto? Is that?
That was probably the last time in person. And then I remember talking to you right before the pandemic all went.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey guys.
Hey,
Hello, Caverly.
Caverly.
We did it.
We are
We
here.
did it. We're
Technology.
here. That's like,
Yes. You wouldn't
There we
believe
go.
the Rube Goldberg setup that we have here right now. Yes.
You need to
Really?
get a picture of that and post that tomorrow if you're.
Yes.
Whatever.
Yeah, Ava, you want to get a picture of this. This is good. So you're my director here, Ava. Should I start? Is it time?
Go ahead.
Hello, everybody. All of you out there in Instagram land or IG land. Now, around my house,
Barry, you're dating yourself.
Yeah.
You're dating yourself, Barry.
that's not too surprising. Yes. Around my house, IG means inappropriate gyrations. So, anyway, I'm Barry Boyce, everyone, founding editor of Mindful Magazine and mindful.org. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this conversation with my good friends, Caverly Morgan and Dr. Christopher Willard, who are also great longtime friends of Mindful, esteemed teachers and authors. And tonight we're going to be talking about their most recent books. So Caverly Morgan is a meditation teacher, author, speaker, and founder of Peace in Schools and the Presence Collective. Most recently, she wrote The Heart of Who We Are, which was included in Mindful's list of top mindfulness books of 2022 and came out just in late 2022, so got in right under the wire. I have to turn off my phone here. What? Oh,
That's probably Chris. He's texting me saying he's out. So I think I don't know how you invite him back. He's here watching, but he needs to be
cool.
invited back in.
It's all right.
Sorry. I like teasing you, Barry, about, how you're dating yourself, but I will tell you, this is like, I've
I'm
never
back.
even done this
It was
before.
me texting you, Barry.
So
Yes, I figured that out. They changed the way you do not disturb on my phone, so I don't know how to not disturb myself anymore.
I'm trying to disturb you.
But Barry, this is the kind of thing, maybe this call will end up being about mindfulness and technology, because I couldn't figure out, okay, if we're doing an Instagram live, how do I put it on airplane mode so people won't call me, but I have to be online? We need some millennials on here to give some instruction.
Well, onward. So, more about Caverly. You can read an excerpt of her book in the February issue of Mindful Magazine, which is on newsstands even as we speak. Dr. Christopher Willard is a psychologist, consultant, and mindfulness thought leader based in Boston. He's led hundreds of workshops around the world and is the author of over 20 books. His most recent book is How We Grow Through What We Go Through.
It's a tongue twister.
Self-compassion practices for post-traumatic growth. And You can also, are you going to juggle your book now? Is that juggle your?
I really like this. I was like, why didn't I think to like flash my book cover? This is what happens after you've written 20 books. You like, you're just prepared. Like he probably has bumper stickers.
The
You
mug
know,
I don't have, the
or-
merch
Just
I don't
showing
have.
off that he can get so many books, he can juggle them. You can also find Chris's book on Mindful's list of the top mindfulness books of 2022. So welcome to the two of you. Why don't we begin with a practice, a moment to arrive, so that all of us out there in Instagram land can drop in and settle in. So Chris, take it away.
I'll begin right in the middle of my coughing fit.
Yeah. Eva, can you give me a glass of water, please?
I did. Can you get me a glass of water, Barry? Thank you.
Yeah, please, Ava. I'd like a glass of water too, please. I didn't think of that.
Well, let's begin. I'll invite everyone to just allow yourself to find a comfortable posture. And we'll take maybe about 2 minutes just to settle ourselves in. If you feel comfortable, you can let your eyes close. You can lower them to the, we used to say floor in front of you. Now maybe we say keyboard in front of you. Just becoming aware of your breath. And then I'll invite you to begin to just stretch your breath. I don't remember where I learned this practice, but just gently beginning to stretch your breath, stretching that exhale. Enjoying, savoring the sensations of the inhale. And just stretching that exhale out a little bit each breath. Enjoying the sensations of the breath, the sounds of the breath. Gently stretching the breath. Savoring and enjoying this opportunity to breathe. Practice together with some old friends. I know I see some old friends, so I can't help but smile. Maybe some new friends. Allowing yourself to smile if it feels natural to this moment. This nice little hangout we've got going. And you can begin to raise your eyes. Before you bring them back to your phone or screen, maybe just take a look around the room. First, reorienting yourself, wiggling your fingers and toes, grounding yourself wherever in the world you are. On this, where I am, it's a cold January evening in winter, but I know we've got global folks watching. So welcome and thank you. It's great to be here. I can't help but smile seeing the two of you on my tiny screen.
So I'd like to start out by asking each of you to share the story of what led to your book and what are the main messages that emerged from that. So what's the driving force behind it, you might say? And what kind of conversations are you trying to stir up with your readers and listeners? So I'm going to flip a coin and figure out who goes first. So Caverly, you get to call. If one side is the queen, the former queen, and the other side, I'm in Canada, the other side is a polar bear. So queen or bear? Go ahead, Caverly. Okay.
I'm the queen, man.
It came up queen, so.
So that means I get to
Exactly.
I'm the queen. I get to choose who
Go.
goes first, Chris, after you.
Go for
She
it.
defers. So take it away, Chris. Tell us about your book. What led to it? What inspired you to write this?
Absolutely. I mean, for me, you know, my favorite way of learning anything is through writing, and I love writing, and please excuse the realistic children not going to bed sound effects in the background. But wanting to learn and wanting to learn more, especially during the pandemic, when suddenly I went from thinking, oh my gosh, I'm never going to work again, which is what happened, you know, or for 2 weeks, I'm not going to work, I guess is how I felt at first. And then it clearly was longer, to then realizing suddenly I was being asked to do so many different talks and workshops about trauma and resilience, and getting really excited when I started to do a bit of research and learn that actually when we experience trauma and difficulty, that the most likely outcome is not, in fact, post-traumatic stress, but actually post-traumatic growth. And I want to be cautious when I say that, because it's not, I don't want to be, you know, one of the things we heard a lot about during the pandemic was toxic positivity. This book is not about that, but it's about how do we create the conditions under which we are likely to grow through challenging times. And we have all been through challenging times, and the entire world a couple of years ago, right, was all going through the same challenging thing in addition to everything else they had going on. And so that's where it got started. And then really learning, how do we care for, bring mindfulness and compassion to our bodies? How do we care for, bring mindfulness and compassion to our minds? And how do we really start to bring these into our relationships? And I think that's a bit of where I think Caverly and I have some similarities in terms of this idea of, you know, we heal together, we heal with others. This can be a group process of liberating and freeing and helping all of us at the same time. In fact, we have to. So that's how the book got started. Yeah, and that's where it is.
So one of the key messages seems to be that, well, we might think that trauma leads to ultimately to damage, or we're worse off. It's actually more likely to lead to growth.
Mm-hmm. And both can happen at the same time, I think, is what else is really important to remember, that we can be in pain and we can grow at the same time. I finished the book while my mother was dying, and I was just describing to someone, it was one of the most beautiful and horrifying moments of my life, you know, being with that experience. So, yeah.
So before we jump over to Caverly, what would you say makes the difference that turns us toward growth in those kinds of circumstances?
Yeah, I think opening with some compassion, I think, can be so incredibly important. Moving slowly and with compassion, which are what certainly the lessons of, to me, mindfulness are so important, and learning how to befriend ourselves and befriend the world again, befriend our bodies, befriend our minds, and befriend others, which to me are the three parts of real healing and growth. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize and share in the book. Yeah. Based on my own experience and people I've worked with and people I've met along this path that we're all on together. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Barry.
Okay, Caverly, take it away.
Well, I appreciate what Chris named as some of the crossover. There's a lot of crossover in our work, and I would be happy to start with that piece about the collective, because that is one of the things that drew me to want to write. Other than, of course, running into you at a conference, Barry, and you and I just troubleshooting about what it would be like if I wrote a book, and you giving me some war stories and tips and thoughts and suggestions. And yeah, I wanted to know, what would it be like to take practices that have been so transformational in my own life personally and apply them collectively. And as Chris is saying, and I think this is why I playfully wanted to go after him, is because I think it's new for us to recognize the degree to which collective trauma is a thing. And not new like it's never been thought of, but new to have so many thought leaders addressing how we can work with collective trauma, to stop seeing trauma as personal events and start to see trauma in relationship to systems, and to start to see trauma in relationship to us as a collective, or various groups collectively as well. So I got interested in what would it be like to apply these tools collectively, not just personally. And then along the way, I got to ask really rich questions like, what are we as a collective? Because we can't, you know, as you know, I come from Zen roots. And so the question about who am I, what is this self, has been alive for me for a very long time. And to not only ask who am I, what am I, but then to bring that question as a collective inquiry as well became an important part of this journey for me. What, you know, who are we? Who are we together? And the other overlapping piece that Chris just spoke to is the importance of befriending. That's a running theme through my book, because we can't apply these practices collectively if we don't know how to be friends with ourselves and friends with the community that we're in, and then friends across lines of difference as well is an important part of my book.
When we talked early on, the idea of the book that you shared with me was collective liberation. And I remember, and I say this to a few people, that unfortunately I have bad news for you. That's good enough to be a book.
I did. That was such a, I remember that so well. I remember where I was standing, it was like you were beginning to, I was sort of pitching something to you, and then you were beginning to deliver what was clearly bad news. And so I thought, okay, well, whatever. I'm not too attached. Okay. Because I respected your take. And then of course, when you ended with, so yes, it is, you do have a book here.
It is a lot of hard work to bring a book to the light of day. So congratulations about that. And and I think it's going to, both of these books are going to bring a lot of benefit. I want to talk a little bit about yours, more about this collective liberation, before going back over to talk about Chris, and Chris can chime in at any point too. So I think you go as far as to say in the book that there really is no individual freedom or liberation, that's a myth. And it's a common myth because, we feel pain right here. We feel this, I'm trapped, I have a problem. And so we think, well, I need to get out of this. So this is about me. So often pursuits become self-help based. What's the flaw there? How does that break down, and why is the collective so necessary?
Well, there's so much in that, Barry. I really appreciate what you're putting forward. I'm definitely picking up what you're putting down. And I want to begin by acknowledging it has been really important for me to name the way in which this isn't a self-help book. At least it's not your typical self-help book, in that I think, to put it simply, so many books that might focus on self-help are reinforcing a sense of, I am this me. I am this individual. And in that reinforcing of, hi, dear Nikki, In that and speaking of the collective, check out Nikki's wonderful work, Nikki Walton, and her amazing podcast. So I want to acknowledge that sense of the collective completely shifts when we graduate from a distorted idea of the individual. And we're living in a time and an era where it's like, we talk about like toxic patriarchy or toxic capitalism. I think there's toxic individualism that leads us to feel cut off from our shared being, our shared humanity. And so I'm really interested in cultivating groups of people that practice together consciously so that we can begin to break down that distortion. And then Barry, with that, as you know from the book, we begin to journey into questioning even more deeply, what is this distortion of I? And then therefore, what does we even mean? We no longer means just a collection of toxically defined individualists. It means something entirely different. And it means something that just the direct experience of what it means in and of itself is a moment of liberation.
So Chris, your book, one of the key words in the title is self-compassion. And, you know, we talk about mindfulness a lot, and we did a little mindfulness practice at the beginning here. I represent something called mindful. But I feel like that word can be misleading in that it can have this, you know, it's a multi-syllabic noun, and it can have this feeling of policing your mind. You know, there's so much talk about, oh, your mind could be wandering, you could be on autopilot, you know, oh my God, the world's gonna end, you gotta pay attention, you gotta be mindful. But both of your books deal with love and self-compassion. I want you to hear you, Chris, talk about why self-compassion is central to your mission. I know not just this book, but knowing you as I do, and your work with both children and adults, this is a key aspect. So please say as much as you can about that.
Yeah, and I think there really is no self-compassion without compassion for others, and vice versa. I think these can move in tandem, and the more we cultivate one, the more we cultivate all of these. And I think just bringing a lot more of that into the world, however it is that we cultivate it, so that it's all spilling over, I think is so important. And one of the things that got me really excited is also learning about, I love the spiritual explanations, I love the self-help explanations, and I love the scientific explanations. And I also want to say, I think, I love this question about, is this a self-help book? And it's like a, you yourself can help the world book. You yourself can save the world, that kind of thing. I think both of these books really are about that. They're not about the self, they're about the self in context, because it's all about the context, right? And that's actually what's so important. But I think this idea of compassion and so many different emotions being contagious, right? Looking at that in terms of, Dan Siegel might talk about the MWE kind of thing. We might think about interpersonal neurobiology. We might think about emotional contagion, but watching. And I think one of the things that we've seen over these past few years is that, people can become so entrenched in this toxic individualism that Caverly talks about, and the polarization that happens with living online and being alone as we were through this pandemic, right? And that can then lead to awful things happening and awful forms of co-regulation as people connect in really toxic ways, right? People connecting with each other around terrible ideas about white supremacy, about violence, about racism, about bigotry and other forms. And yet also we can come together in these absolutely amazing ways as human beings and co-regulate each other, and our emotions be contagious, whether it's emotions about generosity, our behaviors about generosity, our emotions of compassion, our emotions of happiness, that these also spread virally in really beautiful and amazing ways. We can look at that from a karmic lens if we want to, in a spiritual sense. If we look at that, we can measure that out with statistics, as some different researchers have done. So I find this also inspiring, that the more we are doing, the more, for ourselves, the more we are always doing for others, and we have the right intentions, and we do this in a skillful way, but we regulate ourselves and we bring more compassion into the world, it really does start to spill over towards so many other people and start to really then affect change. And as Caverly said, within yourself, within your group, within your community, and hopefully then across communities and across bridges, so that we're not so polarized, we're not so atomized, we're not so toxically individual as we are here, certainly in North America and in Europe. And I think when we look at other parts of the world, without being too broad, we can see how practices are so meant to be practiced in community, and that's actually where change happens, is in community, and the community impacts the individual, and the individual impacts the community, and we see that they are the same. Is what.
Well, it's possible that in the news we hear, and maybe even in our homes as we're growing up, we're taught that we're bad, that there are these bad people doing bad things. I mean, that's where polarity comes from. We start there. When you talk about love, think, okay, love is something I have to work toward, somehow loving these awful people, yourself included. How is it possible to start with love, to just go there? Which, how do you get to that? Because it seems like if you buy into this reality you've created of you're a bad person, they're bad, and fighting, then love seems like an awful lot of work. So, Caverly, you want to say something about that?
Sure. Barry,
How
I
did
love
I know
to
that?
talk about love. So it does seem important to me that we not treat love as a task. For example, if I'm seeing a book, and I do want to be careful. I don't want to poo-poo self-help books. There's a place for everything. So if someone just read a self-help book that helped them do X, Y, or Z, and they'd never done that before, wonderful. I want to underline, it's not bad or wrong. In the same way that it's not bad or wrong for me to practice loving a quote unquote enemy. But I am drawn to name the importance of love as the recognition of our shared humanity or shared being, and love as a starting point, love as not a task that I either did well or didn't do well. Love is something that isn't reinforcing this felt sense of separateness. So this idea of individualism would suggest, individual on an individual path would suggest that I'm going to get better at loving, that I can practice loving, that, oh shit, today I really didn't do that well because I can think of all the people that I didn't love well today. And it's keeping a sense of me in place that's a somewhat solid structure, that I'm offered this promise that someday, if I keep working at it, I'll finally get to have the experience I long to have, which ironically enough for most people is some form of love, some form of getting to just rest as ourselves, and not that individual, that kind of toxic individual that I'm referring to tonight, not that self, the self that we recognize as larger than that, getting to rest as that self, and then recognizing that that self is not actually separate. It's not, it's not separate from other quote unquote selves. That's the love that, when we're resting in that, when we're resting as that, that's the love that truly transforms, because the way we begin to see the world is different. The way we are moving through our experiences of trauma is different. The way that we engage with our hopes and dreams is different.
So you said resting as love, not just in love, but as love. Does that make any sense to you, Chris?
I think, I'm thinking also, Barry, about what you say about, how do we, what is love work, right? Does this seem like an awful lot of work? And I think it is, but I think what we know both, about our experiences, about the experiences of others that we've encountered and read and learned from, is that, to me, it can be a bit like priming the pump, right? It's like it takes a lot of work to get that pump going, right? And then suddenly it starts to overflow, right? And then it's like, what do we do with all of this? And I think that to me is the point that we want to try to get to with love, with compassion, with all of these things, which we also then know what's happening at the level of our nervous system, is that we are then opening up in all kinds of ways. We're opening up for trusting the world. We're opening up for healing, both physically and mentally and spiritually and emotionally, in all of these different ways. And then it opens us up that we then have enough that our presence begins to truly, in some ways, heal others. And I don't want to sound too like woo-woo about it, but this is really what we know in terms of the science of the ways that the relational science in terms of how we relate to others, and how love and compassion and feelings of safety and the chemicals that are released when we experience these things really start to work, is that they really do start to, we've all been in the presence of someone who is just so present, we feel good when we're with them, right? That is that, whether it's charisma or spirituality, or whether it's maybe just the presence of a ton of love, right, that they have, that we start to feel good because we start to feel safe in that way, and we can start to heal. And that's something we can cultivate in ourselves. And yet it is work to get to that point where we're not just keeping it to ourselves or those people that we like.
Well, I think it's interesting the kind of work it is. From what, I mean, you can have the understanding that we are love already, but it may need to be cultivated,
yeah,
and worked with. And so, both of you have benefited from a lot of practices, and you share a variety of practices that you've used over the years with all sorts of different kinds of folks, starting with yourselves. So, Chris, can you think of a practice that's made a difference in your life that you could use as an example, one that's mentioned in your book?
Yeah, to me, I think a lot of the more simple self-compassion practices, perhaps some of those from Chris Germer and from Kristen Neff, of just the realization and the revelation really of common humanity that Caverly also mentioned, is just so helpful. The idea that we know that we are not alone, that we can, embrace our differences and celebrate them, but also see that there are these common threads of humanity when we choose to, when we choose toxic individuality, right? We're choosing to compare ourselves constantly to other people, and we can get into, oh no, they're following network, whatever with that too. But also when we choose to identify with others and identify what our commonalities are, right, in a positive way, then I think that also can be so incredibly healing. So just that revelation of, certainly during the pandemic, doing far too many workshops for other people and not enough self-care, but of like, look, none of us have been through a pandemic before. None of us know what the heck we're doing in this. And whether it was in a Zoom space or occasionally in a live space, being able to just realize and name that we are not alone was just seeing the tremendous relief that that brought to others and to ourselves. And then it could, you know, then turn back into more toxic individuality, which we saw plenty of during this time too. But seeing that, oh, what happens when we come together with what is our shared experience as humans too is so important. Or when we look at difference, we think about the beauty of difference and not the fear of difference, I think is also so important, because I don't want to say, oh, let's all, you know, be colorblind or let's all pretend we're all the same. That's not what I'm saying, but that we have these fundamental human attributes that I think are so important to celebrate and relate with each other.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question here in a minute, but Caverly, I know some of the practices you've used in Peace in Schools and in the Presence Collective and that are mentioned in your book have to do with inquiry. Continually interrogating your experience in particular ways. Like one of them that I think of is looking at your survival strategies, you know, to know how have I survived. And maybe you could talk about that as an example, or another example of a simple kind of inquiry that the part about knowing that your love is really, that's about wisdom and seeing, an inquiry can help bring that about. So can you share an example of a inquiry type practice?
Yeah, and I'm appreciating this conversation about love very much. It does seem that it could be helpful to be clear about what kind of love we're talking about, because we use the words so freely. You know, are we talking about I love this shirt? Are we talking, which by the way, I like that you all planned out the whole plaid thing. I'm sorry I missed the memo. Are we talking about I love my mother? Are we talking about the love that in my book I refer to as love with a capital L, love that's sort of more all-encompassing and has nothing to do with objects. It has nothing to do with what we say we love. And that kind of love is not a love that we get better at, we're worse at, we have to practice. So I think that could be clarifying for us. And that relates to what you're saying, Barry, about survival strategies, because, and I'm glad you brought in survival strategies, Barry, because I think it connects very much with Chris's book as well. You know, that how are we surviving our traumas, to tie in with, some of the things that Chris talks about. So a place of inquiry that we offer young people in Peace in Schools, and I offer folks that I work with, is paying attention to all the different ways that we don't let ourselves know the love with a capital L, the vast experience of love that's actually without object. And some people might say, I mean, just to make it really grounded, some people might say, oh, that's, I have a moment where everything falls away and there's just this experience of vastness in an orgasm, but it's pretty short-lived. And so then it's gone, and I'm sort of grasping for an experience again, an experience of, I believe that in French, it means, or orgasm, I believe means, a little death. That experience where those objects fall away, or the attempt, the striving to quote unquote love something, or also the surviving of our lives. That's only existing when we're identified with a small I and looking for potentially like a small love. We're conditioned to try to meet our needs in specific ways through coping mechanisms and these survival strategies. So the inquiry becomes, what are these coping mechanisms? What are these survival strategies? And what gets us beyond the sort of quick fixes of love with a lowercase L and moves us into experiencing love with a capital L, experiencing the love that we know in the marrow of our bones.
I think that also relates well to the a collective idea of what we need to do together. That kind of work is, I find, is to me more powerful and in some ways easier to do together. It takes that kind of intense focus off yourself, and you realize this path, this kind of journey, you know, we've all saddled ourselves and been saddled with survival strategies. And even to use the word saddled, you know, it's a bit more, I mean, hey, it's natural. You do things to try to survive, and you wake up and you find I need these now? Let's look at these.
We've learned how to try to get these needs met, and at some point in practice we get to ask, but is it really giving me, is it delivering what I
there's
really,
a question out there
want?
that one of the folks would like you to define. How do you define trauma? Chris, this is from Rafael Puebla.
Thank you, Rafael. I think this is a really hard question that actually came up when I started writing this book, and we're in some ways a bit of a bubble almost with trauma, where it is so important that we're talking about it, and everybody's talking about it in some ways, and yet we're all sort of often wondering, like, well, what is it that we're talking about? And in some ways, I think it's those experiences that happen to us that are also, as Caverly said, that lead to those, like, getting into just how do we survive and not necessarily how do we thrive. And the experiences that have rewired our nervous system because we're experiencing some kind of catastrophic threat to ourselves or to someone that we love, or seeing something like that, that then really does rewire us to see and perceive the world and act as if the world is a more dangerous place than it necessarily is. And I think what we want to do is try to, as Caverly is also saying, unlearn some of this survival stuff, because what we want to do is be in survival mode when it's helpful to be in survival mode, which probably a lot of us have been in our lives, and yet also be in that mode where we're able to really thrive and grow and expand. Survival mode is also, it's not about growth, right? Thriving is about growth. How can we reactivate that through, you know, the activation of, you know, our nervous system in different ways, or our spiritual system, or our relational system in all of these different ways, learn to re-inhabit our bodies in these different ways that feel like they've perhaps betrayed us somehow, or our minds that have betrayed us, and learn how to really thrive in this world, in our bodies, in our minds, in our relationships with others, and in that way help the world to truly thrive too. So that's kind of a little wordy definition.
No, well, it's a challenging concept, and like most complex terms, that, you know, it's describing a range,
Right. Yeah.
Obviously, and you know, everything from, you know, my daughter got bullied a lot when she was in school. I just couldn't figure it out why these two girls just decided to choose her. So that's not the trauma of being shot. At the same time, you know, it's a certain kind of conditioning results from that, and you live life based on that conditioning. So a lot of what we really end up talking about, and a lot of what people have been coming out of the pandemic thinking about, is healing. You know, this kind of healing isn't healing a wound, but it's, you know, an inner kind of healing. And, you know, we're offering mindfulness, awareness, these practices for that kind of healing. How do you start if that process, if you don't have any idea where to begin? You know, you're just kind of chasing your own tail, that I ought to be able to heal myself, but I have no frigging idea how to do it. And so, you know, how do you begin? That's the last question, by the way, before we do a little practice. So.
Yeah, Caverly, how do we begin?
Oh, Touche. So fair for you to pass this to me. You know, I actually do have something arising. I think what's beautiful about practice and life is that there's so many unique pathways, and that how we begin depends on who we are and what we need. So for one person, beginning might mean going on a meditation retreat. For another person, it might mean going to a really good therapist. For another person, it might mean, oh my God, I never was able to name, there's a problem here and it needs to be addressed. And the beginning is just saying there's a problem. So there's a kind of self-reckoning that's happening. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that. It's not as though there's a one-size-fits-all way to move beyond our survival strategies and thrive rather than survive. And I am a big fan of the beginning of the healing journey being the recognition that we have what we need to be our own teacher. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't get mentors or therapists or teachers to support us, but to recognize that listening to ourselves is step one regarding finding out what we need.
Well, I think that understanding also helps us, if I may say, to find that the best kinds of teachers are the ones who help us to find things from the inside out, rather than that. Yeah.
That turn us back to ourselves.
You know, somehow we're lacking the resources, and they're going to be provided by someone from the outside, rather than that together we can work with teachers to find those resources.
Yeah. And Barry, I think that word together is so key, because that's a piece of trauma or an aspect of how we define trauma that's interesting to me. Is, in my experience, it's really not about, you mentioned someone being shot versus someone being bullied. It's really not actually about the content. The content shouldn't be dismissed, but it's about how we're in relationship with the content. And if I feel deep isolation based on, if I'm isolated in whatever the event is, it's not the event itself that is necessarily the problem. It's what my conditioned system does with it. And we do that personally. We have personal trauma and we have collective trauma. We as a society have done things with what has happened. And a lot of harm gets caused through these sort of silent agreements with how we've coped, if you will.
So before we end with a practice from Caverly, Chris, I'm going to give you the last word.
Only one.
Only one, Chris.
You already used two.
I'm just so grateful to be here, and I think to come back to that idea of what is amazing is that this is inside of ourselves, like this ability to heal, and what a real healer does, a good therapist, a good meditation teacher, a good coach, a good friend can do, is help us find that we are capable of more than we know we are capable of, and not someone that we become dependent on, but someone who points out the way that we can relate to ourselves in a different way, relate to our experiences in a different way, and draw on more strength than we ever knew that we had. And that, to me, is the message of both of these books. And I think the message also that we as a society, I think, as Caverly says too, have so much more strength when we look inward, when we have the courage to look inward as individuals and as a society, that we have the strength, we have the resources to heal ourselves and to heal all of us, individually and collectively.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I'm glad you didn't keep it to one word. Because that was so well said,
So,
really.
Caverly,
So well said.
Close with the practice.
Sure. So come into
Page,
any...
Caverly.
I love you guys, I gotta say it. All right, so come into any position that is comfortable for you for 9 minutes of resting as yourself. I'm going to explore what we mean by that a little bit. So as we wind down, for many of us, this is winding down the end of perhaps a long day. The invitation here is not to rest in the self that experienced specific traumas today or earlier in life. It's not to rest in the self that's working really hard to be a more mindful person or a more loving person, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, according to a conditioned standard. The invitation, rather than having the attention on those various things that I just listed, my traumas, my conditioning, my habit of striving, my habit of assessing. For these last minutes together, free the attention from that activity and from those objects. Allow it to rest. Allow the attention to rest. If it feels accessible to you in this moment, you might even say that you're allowing the attention to rest in love itself, not love of a specific object, but love itself. And if this is starting to feel abstract or hard to connect with, follow Chris's lead. Place the right hand on the center of the chest and place your left hand right where the ribs come in together to touch. And let this embrace of compassion hold your exploration right now. Sometimes it can be scary or threatening to the system to release the attention from all of these things we've been attached to throughout the day. Feel the safety of your own embrace. As you give the attention permission to rest. If you'd like to release your hands, you can. You might enjoy keeping them there. But stay with this experience of resting in your own embrace. The vast embrace that's larger than your storylines, larger larger than your inner critic, larger than the things you fear, larger than the things you long for. And then allowing yourself consciously to take 3 of the longest and deepest inhalations and exhalations you've taken yet today. Stretching the breath as Chris started us off with. And in whatever way feels authentic to you, expressing some form of gratitude to yourself for showing up, and then also to this community for holding your experience, even if just on an energetic level. Thank you.
So, and thank you, Chris, Caverly. Nice to be with both of you, and thanks for the time we've spent together, and thanks to everyone who tuned in out there in Instagram land. So you can find more information and links to how to order the books that we were talking about tonight on mindful.org and on Chris and Caverly's websites, which you can find by visiting their Instagram profiles. So you can read these books and listen. Chris, is yours listenable yet?
My book?
Yes.
Yes. Yep. They didn't let me do the voiceover, but yeah, I failed my audition, but what are you going to do? Self-command.
So if you want to read and or listen, you can do both. You can either or both. So please, I encourage you to dive into the work of both of these wonderful people and share it with others. So thanks again for being here, and good evening, good night, and lots of love.
Thanks so much, Barry. Really, thanks so much for hosting. Appreciate your love and your generosity of spirit. Chris, it's always a hoot to be with you. Thanks for just being
Thank you both.
fun.
This was a blast and wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Okay, till next time. Thanks.
All right. Ciao,
Bye-bye.
friends. Onward and upward.